out of Denmark, which said there was a genuine decline in semen quality over the past 50 years. That in Japan, which is in yellow, but now they are below 1.5. And when this testosterone is suppressed, there are a number of changes which have been termed the phthalate syndrome. If the mother is exposed to phthalates, what happens to her son? Does that child experience the phthalate syndrome? Lowering the sperm count has other consequences besides that when sperm concentration is lower, the man dies younger.
胎児期にホルモン用物質の暴露を受けた人が回復するための手立てはありますか？
There's also some evidence that if the AGD is short, that adding testosterone may, and this is very preliminary, may help to lengthen that AGD. I think this is an area that really needs research because we have so much distortion of the genitals. We need to really work hard to think about how to fix this.
それでは時間となりましたので、開始いたします。本日はお忙しい中、ダイオキシン環境ホルモン対策国民会議の国際市民セミナーへご参加いただきありがとうございます。本日はまず、ご挨拶、こちらからご挨拶を一言申し上げた後、スワン博士に35分ほどの内容でお話をいただきます。その後、質疑応答の時間を設ける予定でございます。講演会に先立ち、当会代表理事、中下優子からご挨拶とともに講師のご紹介をさせていただきます。
はい、皆さんおはようございます。本日は私どもダイオキシン環境ホルモン対策国民会議の国際市民セミナーにお集まりいただきましてありがとうございます。私代表理事を務めさせていただきます中下優子でございます。実はJEPA が設立されましたのは私は本業弁護士なんですけれども158名の弁護士女性弁護士とそれから学際的50名の発起人の方々によって1998年の9月に設立されました。でその契機になりましたのは私たち女性弁護士の間で奪われし未来という本を読んだことからでした。そしてその中には人間の精子も減少しているんじゃないかという話がございました。野生生物の生殖危機はいろんな種の生物たちに現れているということが警告をされていました。そして、その当時はですね、日本もすごい社会的な関心が盛り上がりまして、あと環境省でもですね、環境ホルモン研究計画スピード98というのを策定し、取り組みを始めました。この取り組み開始は、実は EU よりも1年早く、環境省は取り組みを開始しました。ところが、その5年後頃から、環境ホルモン問題はまだまだ不明なことが多い。特に人への健康影響というのは明らかではないというような論調で、いろんな意見が主張されるようになりました。で、その中で、環境省は、2005年には環境ホルモンは、あまり大した問題ではない、ある意味でそんなに杞憂だったんだと。いうような流れの中で、スピード98を取り下げてしまい、環境ホルモンリストも取り下げてしまいました。幕引きされてしまったわけです。以来、日本では環境ホルモンはもう大したことがない、あれは空騒ぎだったんだというように皆さんが思って、報道もなぜか全く環境ホルモン報道というのがなされなくなってしまいました。でも皆さんもお分かりのように、この問題は人工の化学物質が人間の生体のホルモンを撹乱するという問題ですから、人類にとって由々しき問題で、本当に重要な問題なんです。で、世界の国々は、その重要な問題であるとの認識に立って、さまざまな研究をして進めてきてこられております。で、そういう中で、この精子の減少の問題も2017年に今日お話を伺います、スワン博士たちが、50% から 60% この約40年間に減少してるんだということを発表されて、 世界では大変衝撃を受け、ショッキングな事実として皆さんが捉えられたんですけれども、なぜか日本ではあまり問題になることはなく、大きな騒ぎにはなっておりません。で、NHK でもこの問題をもちろん取り上げてはいたんですけれども、その原因は何かということについては一切とは言いませんね、生活スタイルが問題じゃないかという指摘はありましたが、化学物質の問題、環境ホルモンの問題であることは一言も言及されないで、NHK の報道番組を終了しておりました。というような状況で、本当に日本ではこの問題は分かっていないんですけれども、スワン先生は、この先ほどの論文に基づいて本をお書きになりまして、カウントダウンという本なんですけれども、それが日本でも翻訳されました。ここにあります生殖機器という、日本語版の本が今年になって刊行されました。で、私も読ませていただいたんですけど、大変大きな衝撃を受けました。今日は皆さんがこのスワン先生のお話を伺うことによって、やはり大変な衝撃を受けられるんじゃないかなというふうに思っております。で、JEPA では今年度からですね、環境ホルモン問題再びということで、もう少し大きな社会的関心を呼び起こして、本当に大変な事実があるわけです。その事実に対して日本は何にも無策で20数年ここを来てます。もう今こそ行動を起こす時だと私たちは切実に思って、取り上げるようにしましたので、ぜひ皆さんのご参加をお待ちしております。で、スワン博士のちょっとご紹介をさせていただきますが、今申し上げたように2017年の論文を書き、そしてこの日本版生殖機器という本も書いておられますけれども、もう20年、アメリカのニューヨーク州のマウントサイナイアイカン医科大学の環境医学公衆衛生学教授で、専門は環境生殖疫学というものが専攻されております。で、20年以上にわたり世界的な精子数の減少および生殖器系の発生と、神経発達に対する化学物質の内分泌撹乱作用の研究をしてきておられます。今日はたっぷりと短い時間ではございますが、スワン博士のお話を伺って私たちも勉強させていただいて、次の行動につなげていけたらなというふうに思っております。最後までお聞きくださいますようお願い申し上げまして、私のご挨拶とさせていただきます。どうもありがとうございました。
では、早速講演会を開始したいと思います。リプロダクティブヘルスの世界的低下、その難題、課題、チャンスということで、シャナ・スワン博士にお話しいただきます。Dr. Swan, thank you very much for joining us today, and please start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for the opportunity to speak to you today about these problems that I've been studying for over 20 years and that I think are concerning to all of us. Today, I'm going to take you on a trip. This is the roadmap. We're going to talk about the problems, causes, consequences, and solutions. And we're going to start with the problem. The problem I'm talking about is a problem of declining reproductive health, and this was first brought to our attention in 1992 by a dramatic paper out of Denmark, which said there was a genuine decline in semen quality over the past 50 years. Even though that 92 paper focused on westernized countries, because that's where the data were, I want to point out that non-westernized countries, including countries in Asia, Africa, and South America, have also been experiencing severe decline. And this slide shows declines on the left in Africa and in the right in westernized countries. And the Western countries are showing a graph from a paper that we published in 2017, which brought a lot of attention to this problem. And you can see that these graphs are parallel, and this is not just a problem of westernized countries. I also want to point out that this is not just a problem for men of sperm quality. Men have many other conditions that are affecting their reproductive health, such as smaller genitals, reduced testosterone, birth defects, and it is not just a problem of men, it is also a problem affecting women. Women contribute, of course, to the problems in low fertility, and they also have problems of their own, such as menstrual problems, endometriosis, early puberty, and miscarriage. And together, men and women are responsible for the problem of declining fertility. So one thing that's very interesting about all of these trends is that they appear to be happening at the same rate. Sperm count has been declining in Western countries at about 1% per year. That is 52% decline in close to 50 years. That's 1% per year. Birth rates have been declining also 50% in 50 years. Here you see the worldwide birth rates, which dropped. That's the fertility rate, total fertility rate, from 5 children in 1960 to 2.4 children in 2018, a drop of 50% in 50 years. And similarly for other trends, the fact that these are happening at the same rate indicates a common cause or set of causes. Here, I want to just hone in on Asian countries and show you the decline in the total fertility rate. Total fertility rate is the number of children that a woman is expected to have in her lifetime. If that number is just over 2, then the couple will replace themselves. And when it drops below 2.1, the population starts to be in danger. And what you see here is that in Japan, which is in yellow, back in 1975, Japan was just about at replacement of just about 2, but now they are below 1.5, and other Asian countries are even lower. And there's now some evidence that in Korea, South Korea, for example, it is below 1. This is getting really critical for the health of the society. There are social causes and non-social causes, and I'll talk more about that, but I wanted to point out, since we're talking about the declines in East Asia, that social factors are really important. Women were given the vote in Japan, I'm sure you know, in 1945, and that was followed by a very dramatic drop in this total fertility rate. As women are given more privilege in society, more economic advantage in society, they will have fewer and fewer children. And the evidence is that they will not reverse that this will just continue as women become more socially advantaged. So this slide is only to point out that the situation is not really better in recent years. In fact, it is slightly worse, and we have no evidence that this is going to turn around. And in other East Asian countries, there is considerable economic effort to support the families having more children, and it doesn't really seem to be working. And this decline in fertility is accompanied by, or is parallel with, a decrease in marriage rates. So you're seeing here that in both men and women, the number who are not married has been increasing dramatically in the same time period, actually earlier in younger men and younger women. So the percent of the population that is marrying has been dropping successively since actually early 1920s, which is kind of surprising, but taken off really in around 1970 to higher and higher rates of couples deciding not to get married or people deciding not to get married. In fact, we have a phenomena, you have a phenomenon in Japan of women marrying themselves. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it's a dramatic example of women preferring not to marry in the traditional way. And I just want to mention that the phenomena of rent-a-family is something new, and I don't know if it goes beyond Japan, but it's a reflection, I think, of this problem with declining fertility and declining family status. And this is something that is related to testosterone. Testosterone is necessary for adequate libido and sexual functioning, and with that declining at the same rate as sperm counts, it's not entirely surprising that you see this phenomenon. So now that we understand there is a problem, let's talk about some of the causes. So we can divide causes into genetics and environment. And this decline of 50% in 50 years or 2 generations is too fast to be genetic. And that means that it has to be environment. And environmental exposures can be broken into chemical exposures and lifestyle exposures. I am not going to talk about lifestyle exposures, although I did mention some of them already. Others might be exercise, stress, and so on. I'm going to focus on the chemical exposures because that's what I've studied most. And those chemical exposures can be broken down into 2 major classes, one of which is those chemicals known as endocrine disrupting chemicals, or EDCs, which are chemicals that have the ability to change the body's own hormones. And those include some classes that are listed here: the phthalates, bisphenols, PFAS chemicals, pesticides, and flame retardants. Here are some illustrations of some of these chemicals. Flame retardants, non-stick coating, Teflon, lining of pans is an example of PFAS chemicals. Here, these rubber ducks are an example of the chemicals that make plastic soft and flexible, such as phthalates. Here are cushions which are full of flame retardants. Here is a low-lying airplane which is spraying pesticide. Here are tin cans lined with bisphenol A, and finally nail polish which contains other phthalates. It turns out that one of the hormones that is most critical for our story here, the story of reproduction, is the hormone testosterone. And this is a hormone that can be affected by these chemicals, in particular those that have the ability to lower testosterone, known as the anti-androgens. One class of anti-androgens are the phthalates, the chemicals that make plastic soft and flexible. I'm going to focus on this because that's where I've done a lot of my work. So just to make this very simple, initially the sex organs in males and females are undifferentiated. They're the same. And then under the presence of testosterone made by the fetal testes in a certain small time in gestation, which we'll talk about, helps the male to develop in a male typical manner the testes, and the female, which is the default, remains with the female setup, which is the ovaries and so on. So this process, which distinguishes the male and the female genitals, is absolutely critically dependent on testosterone. And anything which lowers testosterone at that particular time can disrupt this process. And this illustrates that normally, in a rat, if the mother is not exposed to an anti-androgen, then there will be a surge, an increase in testosterone around in the middle of this period, 17 to 21 days of gestation. However, if the mother is given phthalates, and this was diethylhexyl phthalate, then you see the yellow line is completely flat. The testosterone surge is suppressed. And by the way, in the female, there is no change of from this exposure. And when this testosterone is suppressed, here by diethylhexyl phthalate, there are a number of changes which have been termed the phthalate syndrome. And those include a smaller penis, a malformed penis, undescended testicles, and a shortening of a distance called the anogenital distance, which I'll come back to. This anogenital distance turns out to be a very critical marker of how much androgen the male or female saw in utero. And it's normally, this distance is normally 50 to 100% longer in males than females in mammals. This is a picture of the anogenital distance in a rat, and it shows you that it is longer in the male than the female, and it is a reflection of fetal androgen exposure. And so we asked, what happens to humans? If the mother is exposed to phthalates, what happens to her son? Does that child experience the phthalate syndrome? And to do that, we had to know how much phthalate the mother was exposed to. And to know that, we had to get a urine sample from a pregnant woman when at the right time in pregnancy. So we got first trimester urine in a pregnancy cohort, and then in another pregnancy cohort, and now there's been quite a few of them. And we were able to look at this question of, is the amount of phthalate that the mother is exposed to in her ordinary life having an effect on the genital development of her son? The answer is yes. We conducted 2 studies in which we showed these 3 things: that phthalates are endocrine disruptors, that phthalate syndrome exists, demonstrated in human males, and that AGD is a marker of fetal testosterone exposure. And we learned that timing was critical to this story. So let's step back and look at another exposure. Let's look at smoking. So when a man smokes around the time of conception of a child, if it's a male, that male may experience a decrease in his sperm count when he's an adult of up to 40%. If the mother smokes when she is carrying that child, he also would experience a decrease in sperm count of up to 40%. When the man himself smokes in adulthood, his sperm will be lower, but only by about 20%. And by the way, that can be repaired by his stopping smoking. So the timing of the exposure, whether it's around the time of conception or during pregnancy, makes a big difference on the effect of the exposure. And for rodents and humans, there is also a critical window for the exposure of phthalates and their effects on the phthalate syndrome. And this was shown in 2010. So now let's look at some of the consequences of this exposure that we're talking about, not only phthalates, but other endocrine disrupting chemicals. So one question that comes up is, if the anogenital distance is short in a boy or in a man, does that matter? Is that important? Is that important for his reproductive function? And the answer is yes. And in this study, which was done in college students who gave a semen sample and allowed us to measure their anogenital distance, we saw that the longer the anogenital distance, the higher the sperm count. A direct correlation between these two measures. So longer AGD means higher sperm count. And not only is AGD important for sperm count, it's also important for fertility. And what you see here is that the longer the anogenital distance, the higher the chance that there's going to be that the man is going to be fertile. And this is true whether he's been childless or whether he's fathered a child. We now know that AGD is important for later fertility as well as sperm count. And lowering sperm count has other consequences besides the effect on fertility. It turns out that when sperm concentration is lower, the man dies younger. There is a direct correlation with life expectancy and sperm count. And this is really important and is a reason for, I think, men to know their sperm count because it is going to be a predictor of their lifelong health, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, and life expectancy. Another consequence of these exposures is the effects in later generations. And this is perhaps a little complicated, but if the mother is considered F0 generation, the fetus F1, then the reproductive cells are F2. They're going to produce the offspring in the third generation. And so there are health effects reported in the F3 generation that when those children were never directly exposed. They were exposed in utero and indirectly. And some people have traced this to actually 7 generations. So we should be aware that a man's sperm count today may reflect not only his own exposure, his mother's exposure, but his grandparents and perhaps his great-grandparents. And I just want to point out, finally, an effect of these exposures on society and the social structure. And you can see that the pyramid showing a strong base for the population and fewer old people have now been reversed. We're somewhere in between here now, but there's going to be a complete reversal where the base is very small and unable to care for the older population that is growing. And so the impacts of these exposures reverberate throughout society and impact the entire social structure. So finally, let's talk about some solutions to these problems. The first thing to notice is that most of these chemicals that I've talked about are not tested before they're put into market. And this has many consequences. One of them is that it makes us, as populations, like guinea pigs in a massive experiment to which we have not given our consent. In fact, only about 250 of the more than 60,000 chemicals in commerce have been directly tested. So here are some solutions. We have to remove chemicals that are hormonally active, that cause harm at low doses, that persist in the environment, and that are untested for toxicity. And we have to replace them with chemicals that don't have endocrine disrupting effects, that are free of low dose effects, that are minimally environmentally persistent, and are shown to be safe prior to marketing. And we have to regulate the chemicals put into commerce by assessing their low dose effects, their mixture effects, because we're exposed to many of these, their environmental persistence, and their risks in untested chemicals. Thank you for listening, and I will take questions, and I encourage you to try to get the Japanese version of Countdown and read for yourself. We have many suggestions of things you can do on a personal level to decrease your exposure.
スワン博士、どうもありがとうございました。では早速なんですけれども、質問が来ておりますので、私の方から、お伺いいたします。まず、フタル酸エステルに暴露した場合、親から子、子から孫へと細胞レベルでの遺伝はされるのでしょうか？
Yes, the child gets disruption of the germ cells in utero. So the mother is exposed, the germ cells are developing in her body. Those cells are also inside the body of her offspring, and they are altered by this exposure, and that then is transferred to that person's children. The subsequent genetic changes, what sometimes called epigenetic changes, have been demonstrated, but the number of generations is still, I would say, controversial.
はい。引き続きフタル酸エステルに暴露した場合なんですけれども、後天的な遺伝子情報の書き換え、エピジェネティクスは行われるのでしょうかということです。
So that is very similar to the first question, and I have to say there is evidence for epigenetic change in subsequent generations, but the number of generations is unclear, and I would say this is still, we would say, a work in progress.
はい。次に、日本では人口減少が深刻な社会問題になっているんですけれども、アメリカでも人口減少は社会問題になっているのでしょうか？
Yes, the population in Western countries populations are also declining. They're not at the same level as the Eastern Asian countries, but there are declines worldwide. And if people want to look at these data, they can go to a very clear website called World Bank Fertility Data. And there you see the fertility rate. You can put in the country, you can put in the year, and you can see for yourself how it has been declining in every country, pretty much, not 100%, but I would say 98% of countries that I've looked at around the world, including the United States.
はい、次の質問に行きます。なぜ AGD の長さが精子の数に関係するのですか？
Good question. So what you're seeing is the effect of disruption of the fetal testes, having many consequences. One of them is shortening of the anogenital distance. One of them is later disturbance of the germ cell, which will later be seen as decreased sperm count. So it's that all of these things are disrupted at the same time. It also includes birth defects of the genitals are then increased if there's been these exposures, risk of testicular cancer. So these disrupt, it's called testicular dysgenesis, and it was coined by Niels Skekkebeck in Denmark, and he showed that all of these things happened at once, and they are totally consistent with the phthalate syndrome. So phthalates cause testicular dysgenesis syndrome, which has as its properties short AGD, low sperm count, increased testicular cancer rates, increased birth defects, decreased fertility. These things are all interrelated and stem from a disruption of the development of the testes in very early fetal life.
ちょっと次に角度を変えたご質問になります。このところ日本でもLGBTQ の方の問題が大きく取り上げるようなことが増えてきているんですけれども、その数が増えているということには化学物質の影響も大きいのでしょうかというご質問です。
That is a difficult and sensitive question. I have to answer it in two parts. First of all, there is definitely evidence that these chemicals can cause and do cause disorders of sexual development. That's a condition where perhaps there's intersex or there's some confusion of the masculinity or femininity of the individual at birth. That can be caused by endocrine disrupting chemicals, definitely in the laboratory. So we know that is possible. Whether that is going on in an individual, a human, is not clear because those studies have not been done. The question of whether these chemicals influence gender identity, which is different from gender choice, what the sexual choice, the choice of your sex of your partner, those are two different questions. So, for example, frogs can be made through the introduction of a pesticide called atrazine. They can be made so that males want to mate other males. Okay, atrazine exposed frogs can be made homosexual. Whether that happens in humans is not clear. But the more difficult question is, are there animals that prefer to be another sex? And that's a question of your mindset, and we can't ask the animals what sex they would prefer to be. So we have no way to know in an animal model whether these chemicals could be doing that. As far as whether this is happening in humans, we don't know. But I want to add that I don't think that these changes are necessarily defects, that they are simply changes, and whether they're good or bad, I think we should avoid putting that value judgment on them.
はい、では次の質問に、進みます。胎児期にホルモン用物質の暴露を受けた人が回復するための手立てはありますか？出生後に暴露を防ぐことにはどの程度意味があるのでしょうかということです。
Yes, interesting questions, both a little different. So there is some evidence that later exposure, that is after the critical window or after birth, to say an anti-androgen can further affect the development of, say, the penile size or the AGD. There's also some evidence that if the AGD is short, that adding testosterone may, and this is very preliminary, may help to lengthen that AGD. So there is some plasticity in these measures, the AGD, the penile length, and so on. And I think this is an area that really needs research because we have so much distortion of the genitals. We need to really work hard to think about how to fix this. Now, this continued exposure on top of the original exposure is also a question that's now being investigated pretty heavily. And I would say we don't know yet. But it is likely that getting a disturbance initially in utero and getting a second hit, if you will, as a child or an adult is going to compound the problem. In other words, it will make it worse. That is how the evidence is looking now.
はい、では次の質問に行きます。精子の減少は重大な問題ですが、精子の減少にはストレスや社会的要因など様々な要因も考えられます。その原因に化学物質が寄与する割合は、どれくらいであるとお考えでしょうか。
As I mentioned, lifestyle factors are important in fertility and sperm count, definitely. But allocating a percent to each of these is really impossible. One reason that it's impossible is because if you're challenged by stress and obesity, perhaps, and smoking and alcohol, you're already weakened and more susceptible to the effects of endocrine disrupting chemicals. These are not acting separately. These are mixtures. So we're exposed to a huge number of stressors, both lifestyle and chemical. And really what we have to look at is what we call the exposome, if you will, the entirety of exposures that can affect our health. And those start several generations before we're born, and they continue throughout our life. So you have a combination of all of the concurrent exposures, the inherited exposures, the in utero exposures. It's extremely complicated, and allocating the percent contributed by each of these, I would say, is difficult, if not impossible.
ありがとうございます。次の質問に参ります。既存の化学物質のうち直接テストされたものは250物質のみというお話がありました。この部分をもう少し詳しく説明していただけますでしょうか。人へのテスト、あるいは疫学データがあるという意味でしょうか。
I'm sorry. That I was referring to testing in a number of any test systems. So that could be in vitro, in vivo, in animals or humans. There's very limited testing in humans because of the time involved. So we're hoping, to get some more efficient. We need to get some more efficient ways to do this testing, given the large number of chemicals. Just let me say, the phthalate studies that I worked on took each of them 5 years, and each of them cost over $5 million. And that's one class of chemical and one set of outcomes. That doesn't test for obesity, it doesn't test for thyroid function, it doesn't test for neurodevelopment, and so on and so forth. So these are extremely difficult things to do in any system, but particularly expensive in humans. And I recognize the challenge, and I think we have to think about, I think we can do this. We got a wonderful vaccine for COVID. Maybe we can do this, but we have to find test systems that can more efficiently identify endocrine action of chemicals, low dose effects, and persistence. And we have to do it quickly. And I think this should be kind of a moonshot effort to do this while we still can.
はい。すみません。たくさん、質問をいただいているんですけれども、最後にお時間の関係でちょっと最後の質問にさせていただきます。すみません。スワン博士は生殖影響についても、で研究 だけではなくって、環境ホルモン作用の子どもの神経発達への影響についてもご研究されているかと思うんですけれども、現在どのようなことが分かって、いますでしょうか。
Oh, that's a huge other topic and more difficult because neurological development is much harder to examine, for example, in rodents. What does autism look like? What does attention deficit look like? What does intellectual disability look like? And so on. So that we don't have the parallels as easily as we do in the physiological endpoints. However, I think we are getting more and more evidence that there are similar actions on the brain. And the brain, I should mention, is also sexually dimorphic, just as the genitals are. And the male brain requires testosterone just as the genitals do. So chemical like phthalates, which affects the masculinization of the genitals, is likely to, and we have evidence can also disrupt the masculinization of the brain.
はい。では、質疑応答はこちらで終了したいと思います。スワン博士、本当に長い時間どうもありがとうございました。通訳サービスはこちらで終了となりますので、どうぞご退出ください。ありがとうございました。
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now you can leave. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
your
Bye.
presentation.
Thank you.
はい、では皆様、こちらで講演は終了になりました。最後に、国民会議より代表の中下より、一言ご挨拶申し上げます。
はい、皆さん長時間にわたりまして熱心に聞いていただきましてどうもありがとうございました。お話を聞いて、皆さんいろいろ感じられるところがあったんじゃないかなと思います。で、昨今の日本の状況に鑑みましても、このような今スワン先生から問題提起があったような、問題は日本でも共通して現象として起こっている。で、その背景に、内分泌撹乱化学物質の問題があるということを私たちはやっぱり認識せざるを得なかったんではないかというふうに思っております。で、問題はやっぱりこれ20数年遅れてしまって日本は対策が全然取られてなくて今現状でもうどんどん出生率が低下して少子化だとか言いながらも子ども庁を作るって少子化対策のために子ども庁を作るとかいう話ですけれどもそこの中にこの観点が全く欠落しているということです。で、お話を聞いたように分かるように胎児期が一番大切なんです。で、私たちジェパではですね、昨年、環境安全基本法という法律の制定を求めての署名活動を行いました。で、その中にはこういったバルネラブルな人々、胎児子どもを典型としますけれどもそれ以外の化学物質に敏感な人々に対するやはり、対策を考えていかなきゃいけないし実施していかなきゃいけないんだとそのための研究が必要なんだ調査が必要なんだということを、強く訴えてきたわけですけれども残念ながら日本はそのような取り組みが現在も至ってもなされていないということで、あります。でこの状況をやっぱりなんとか変えていきたいというのがジェパの願いでありまして今日聞かれてそういえばというふうに思われた方々はたくさんおられるかと思いますのでぜひご一緒に、大きな世論を形成してそして政府に対して具体的な対策を迫っていきたいというふうに思っております。この胎児期の非常に脆弱なウィンドウですねの時期をやっぱり避けるっていうことをこの化学物質暴露をですね避けるということを何とかして実現していかないと生まれてしまってこういった 何でしょうか、影響を受けてしまっている、子どもたちにですね、なかなか私たちとしては、今の状況では回復の手立てっていうのが見つけられているわけではありませんので、まずは避けることを直ちにできるだけ早くというのを実現していかなければいけないんじゃないかなと思いますので、ぜひ皆さんご支援ご協力を今後ともよろしくお願い申し上げます。どうも本日は長い間ありがとうございました。
どうもありがとうございました。では、終了後、アンケートの画面が出ますので、ぜひご協力をいただきたいと思います。よろしくお願いいたします。では、本日こちらで終了いたします。